The shell screamed through the pre-dawn darkness, racing at 2,000 feet per second. Inside its nose, no bigger than a child's fist, a radio transmitter came to life. The Japanese Val dive bomber never saw it coming. The pilot had already pulled up from his attack on the USS Helena, thinking he was safely out of range. He was wrong. The shell passed just 70 feet from his aircraft and exploded without making contact. It was a physics-defying miracle, one that would forever change the nature of warfare. It was January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal. The Helena's gunners had fired only 3 shells, and all 3 detonated near their target. The Val bomber was torn apart in a flash of shrapnel and flames, crashing into the Pacific like a broken toy. The gunners stared at each other in disbelief. They had just witnessed the first ever use of a secret weapon that had been more classified than radar, and as protected as the Manhattan Project. The Japanese pilot never knew what hit him, nor did his superiors. Over the next 2.5 years, Japanese aviators would fall from the skies in enormous numbers, torn apart by forces they couldn't understand. American ships, once sitting ducks, turned into floating fortresses of death. Kamikaze pilots, diving with fanatical determination, would explode midair before reaching their targets. German generals watched in shock as their troops were decimated by artillery that seemed to know exactly where to strike, detonating with pinpoint accuracy above their heads. The weapon responsible for all this devastation was called the VT fuse variable time fuse. Though the name was misleading, a deliberate misdirection. There was nothing variable about the timing. Inside each shell was something the enemy couldn't fathom. A miniature radar station, a feat of engineering so compact that it fit in your hand yet survived forces that would crush a human body. It was artillery that could see, and to those on the receiving end, it felt like cheating. Before we reveal how this impossible device worked, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us which World War II technology fascinates you most. Now let's take a step back to where it all began. The year was 1940, and the Battle of Britain was raging above the skies of England. Fighter planes twisted and dove through flak-filled skies, and the grim reality became undeniable. Anti-aircraft guns were almost ineffective. Gunners had 2 options, both terrible. They could use contact fuses, which only exploded if they physically hit the aircraft, an outcome so unlikely it was almost laughable. Crews had to fire an average of 2,500 shells to hit a single target. Or they could use timed fuses set to explode at a specific altitude. But aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and unpredictable. By the time the shell reached the detonation point, the plane had already moved, and the explosion would scatter harmlessly through empty air. The odds were brutal. A pilot could survive multiple attack runs, flying through storms of steel that never touched him. Ships faced an even worse situation. Japanese torpedo bombers were causing havoc in the Pacific. Approaching under the cover of dotness enveloped the sky, making visual targeting nearly impossible. A single successful attack could sink a carrier holding thousands of men. The U.S. Navy watched their ships burn and realized that something had to change. In September 1940, a British delegation, known as the Tizard Mission, arrived in America, bringing technical secrets designed to foster a weapons development partnership. Among their offerings was a rudimentary circuit design for a radio-based proximity detector. The idea was theoretically simple. Place a tiny radio transmitter in the nose of a PLA shell that would detect when it neared a target and automatically trigger detonation. American. Scientists at the National Defense Research Committee saw the potential immediately. But potential alone was meaningless without practical implementation. The challenge seemed nearly impossible. The task was to fit a working radio transmitter, receiver, battery, and detonation circuit into a space smaller than a coffee cup. Then, it needed to survive the forces of being fired from a 5-inch naval gun 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to turn a human body into paste. The glass vacuum tubes common in 1940s electronics would shatter like crystal under such pressure. Engineers said it couldn't be done, but they were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The man who made the impossible possible was Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist leading Section T at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. Tuve was brilliant, determined, and utterly convinced that the proximity fuse could work, despite every expert telling him it was impossible. His team faced a challenge that seemed to defy the laws of physics, creating miniaturized electronics in an era when radios filled entire rooms and ensuring that they could survive forces capable of destroying steel. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1940, Western Electric and RCA were manufacturing miniature vacuum tubes for hearing aids, delicate glass tubes about the size of a pinky finger. The British had already ordered 20,000 of these tubes for fuse experiments. Admiral Harold Bowen's team realized their potential and reached out to the manufacturers. If hearing aid tubes could amplify whispers, maybe, just maybe, they could be made robust enough to withstand artillery fire. But durability alone wasn't enough. The fuse needed a power source that could activate during flight, yet remain dormant during storage and handling. Tubbs engineers came up with an ingenious solution: a wet cell battery, a glass tube filled with an electrolyte solution. When the shell was fired and began spinning, centrifugal force would push the solution against metal contacts, triggering a chemical reaction that generated electricity. The spinning shell acted as its own activation switch. Once armed, the fuse emitted radio waves at approximately 180 megahertz. When these waves bounced back from a nearby aircraft, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the frequency shift indicated that the target was close enough, the fuse would trigger the explosion. The engineering was exceptional, but the manufacturing challenge was even more daunting. Each fuse contained around 130 separate miniaturized components, all requiring precise assembly. The shells had to be flawlessly reliable. A premature detonation could destroy the firing ship, while a dud would result in wasted ammunition and the potential loss of the secret. Testing began in 1941. But no one knew if it would work in real combat. Lives depended on fragile glass tubes surviving extreme conditions. On August 12, 1942, the USS Cleveland floated in Chesapeake Bay for a scheduled test, which Navy officials expected to be only a demonstration at best. 3 radio-controlled target drones buzzed through the sky in evasive patterns while the Cleveland's gunners prepared to fire the first proximity fuse shells in controlled conditions. Officers from the Bureau of Ordnance observed through binoculars, taking notes. The drone operators were confident. They had never lost a drone during the first day of testing. The aircraft were expensive and difficult to replace, but they always survived initial trials. The Cleveland fired. The first shot hit a drone and destroyed it completely. Not just damaged, obliterated. The drone operators stared in disbelief. They launched a second drone. The Cleveland fired again. Another direct hit. The officials from Washington stopped taking notes and simply watched, stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. The test was scheduled for 2 days, but by the end of the first day, all 3 drones had been destroyed. The Navy canceled the remaining tests. There was nothing more to prove. They immediately ordered mass production. But a significant problem remained: secrecy. The proximity fuse represented such a substantial tactical advantage that its existence was classified at the same level as the atomic bomb project. If the Germans or Japanese captured even one unexploded shell and reverse-engineered the technology, the advantage would be lost. Intelligence reports showed that German scientists had been working on proximity fuse design since the 1930s, though they had failed to produce anything operational. The Japanese had pursued similar research. Neither enemy could learn that America had succeeded. The solution was ruthless. Proximity fuses could only be used over open ocean, where dud shells would sink to depths beyond recovery. This limitation meant the weapon couldn't be used for its most practical application: air-bursting artillery against ground troops, despite the many Allied soldiers who suffered because of the restriction. Field commanders in Europe repeatedly requested access to the fuses, but their requests were denied. The Navy would be the first to receive them, and only in situations where retrieval by the enemy was essentially impossible. In November 1942, 5,000 VT fuse shells were secretly shipped to Pearl Harbor. These shells were distributed to 3 ships, the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, and the light cruiser USS Helena. Crews were trained under strict security protocols. They were told that these were experimental shells and were ordered never to discuss them. The technical documentation was carried by officers in briefcases fitted with lead weights, ready to be thrown overboard if capture seemed imminent. The shells themselves appeared almost ordinary from the outside, distinguishable only by an unusual nose cone. But inside that nose cone was machinery that seemed like something out of science fiction. Commander William Parsons, who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay, personally oversaw the first shipment to Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet in the South Pacific. He conducted training sessions aboard the ships, explaining that these shells didn't need to hit the target. They only had to get close. Sailors were skeptical. One gunner later recalled thinking it sounded like magic. Others feared the shells might explode inside the gun barrels. But safety mechanisms ensured that detonation couldn't occur until 0.7 of a second after firing, by which time a shell would be hundreds of feet away. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 was a nightmare for American ships. Japanese pilots, still highly trained and experienced, conducted devastating torpedo and dive bomber attacks. Night raids were particularly lethal because the darkness made visual targeting almost impossible. Ships without fighter cover were essentially defenseless. The standard anti-aircraft strategy involved creating a wall of steel and hoping for lucky hits. But the mathematics were grim. Studies showed that thousands of rounds were needed to bring down a single aircraft, and by the time so many rounds had been fired, the torpedo was already in the water, heading toward the ship's hull. Admiral Halsey was especially concerned about the Japanese Betty bombers conducting nighttime torpedo runs. These twin-engine bombers could approach low over the water, launch their torpedoes from a distance, and then escape before conventional anti-aircraft fire could respond. Could adjust. Radar helped detect them, but detection meant nothing if the shells exploded harmlessly behind the target. What Admiral Halsey needed was ammunition that could hit aircraft even when they couldn't be clearly seen. He was about to get just that. On January 5, 1943, in the pre-dawn darkness off Cape Hunter, Guadalcanal, the task force steamed through hostile waters. Crews manned battle stations, and radar operators stared at their green screens, watching for the blips that signified incoming aircraft. At 0615, the blips appeared 4 Japanese Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers approaching fast and low. By 1943, the VALs were considered obsolete, slow, lightly armored, but still piloted by determined men carrying 500-pound bombs. A single bomb, dropped in the right spot, could cripple a cruiser. The VALs screamed in, picked their targets, and began their dives. One bomb hit the New Zealand light cruiser Achilles before the bomber pulled up and tried to escape. The other 3 bombers dropped their payloads and banked hard. trying to distance themselves from the American guns. Standard doctrine suggested they would escape. The valves were already pulling away, anti-aircraft fire trailing behind them. But the Helena was not firing standard ammunition. Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery, had attended Commander Parsons' briefing about the new shells and trusted the physics, even if he didn't fully understand them. His gunners tracked the departing valves, even though it seemed they were out of range. They fired 3 shells in quick succession. The first shell passed by without detonating, still too far. The second shell closed to within 70 feet. Its radio transmitter detected the reflected signal from the aircraft's aluminum airframe. The circuit closed. The shell exploded in a burst of fire and shrapnel, traveling at thousands of feet per second. The valve's wing shredded and the aircraft spiraled out of control before crashing into the Pacific. The third shell was unnecessary. For a moment, the Helena's gunners stood frozen. They had just shot down an aircraft without ever hitting it. The spent shells ejected from the gun, smoking in the tropical air, and nobody quite believed what they had just witnessed. But the wreckage burning on the water told the story. The Japanese had no idea what had just killed them. Within hours, the Helena submitted a gunnery report that would forever change naval warfare. The report made its way to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, triggering immediate action. Production, which had already been ramping up, went into overdrive. 5 companies were tasked with assembling the fuses: Crossley Corporation, ACA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McKay Norris. Behind them, 87 different firms operating 110 factories produced components. In Ipswich, Massachusetts, the Sylvania Electric plant completely retooled for fuse production. Hundreds of women worked 12-hour shifts under conditions of absolute secrecy, assembling miniature vacuum tubes by hand under magnification. The workers weren't told what they were building. Security guards searched employees entering and leaving the premises. Even local police and firefighters were barred from entering the factories. The women, unaware of the true nature of their work, believed they were making components for hearing aids. In reality, they were assembling the most advanced weapons technology in the world. By late 1943, factories were producing 40,000 fuses per day. By 1945, production peaked at 70,000 per day. Each fuse cost around $18, roughly $250 in today's currency. But the cost was insignificant compared to the value of the ships and lives saved. The program eventually cost over $1 billion 1940s dollars, the equivalent of approximately $15 billion today. It became one of the 3 most expensive secret weapons programs of World War II. Alongside the Manhattan Project and radar development. In the Pacific, word about the funny fuse spread rapidly throughout the fleet. Captains and admirals who had seen its effectiveness demanded more. Carrier task forces, once vulnerable to air attacks, transformed into floating death traps for Japanese aircraft. The statistics were staggering. In 1943, though only 25% of anti-aircraft shells used proximity fuses, those 25% accounted for 51% of all aircraft shot down by naval gunfire. The proximity fuse was 3 to 4 times more effective than traditional time fuses. The impact on night combat was even more dramatic. Proximity fuses increased night kill ratios by 370%. Suddenly, darkness no longer shielded the attackers. American ships could destroy aircraft they could barely see. And the Japanese had no countermeasure. But perhaps the most telling statistic was this: with conventional time fuses, a 5-inch gun required an average of 1,000 shells to down a single aircraft. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to about 250 shells. The lethal fragment area of a proximity fuse shell was 3,000 square feet, compared to just 60 square feet for a contact or time fuse. It was the difference between trying to swat a fly with a needle versus swatting it with a tennis racket. And the Japanese were the fly's dot in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Later dubbed by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation, once the finest in the world, faced utter destruction. By 1944, most of their experienced pilots were dead, and the replacements had only basic training. As they attacked the American Carrier Task Force, they flew into a coordinated defense system that combined radar detection, fighter direction, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. The results were catastrophic. Approximately 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, many of them by shells that exploded without direct hits. American gunners, once fearful of air attacks, now felt almost invincible. One sailor later recalled watching Japanese planes explode in midair before they could even get close enough to be identified visually. He described it as though it were like ... watching fireworks. But the Japanese were learning, not the technical details. They never figured out the proximity fuse existed, but they did realize that their conventional attack methods were now suicidal. Bomb and torpedo runs against American ships had become near impossible missions. Hit percentages plummeted to single digits. Experienced pilots, who once had reasonable chances of survival, were dying on their first missions. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed a new strategy, and they chose the most desperate one imaginable, turning their pilots themselves into weapons. If conventional attacks couldn't penetrate American defenses, maybe suicide attacks could. The proximity fuse, by making normal air combat nearly impossible, may have inadvertently pushed the Japanese to develop kamikaze tactics that would define the final year of the Pacific War. On October 25, 1944, the escort carrier USS St. Lo was operating off the Philippines when a Zero fighter, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, turned directly toward the ship. But this was no ordinary attack run. The pilot made no attempt to pull away. Instead, he crashed directly into the flight deck. The resulting explosion detonated the ship's torpedo and bomb magazine, causing the St. Lo to sink in less than 30 minutes. It was the first successful kamikaze attack, and it terrified American naval commanders. Proximity fuses could destroy aircraft approaching for bombing runs. But a kamikaze pilot didn't need to maneuver or escape. He just needed to reach the ship, and he was willing to die in the process. The mathematics of kamikaze combat were different. Standard anti-aircraft doctrine assumed that aircraft would attempt to survive, take evasive action, and eventually turn away. Kamikazes did none of those things. They came straight in, often diving from high altitudes at maximum speed, becoming harder to track and hit. Time fuses were nearly useless, as the rate of change in the aircraft's distance was so rapid that calculated detonation points became obsolete almost instantly. Even proximity fuses, while still the best weapon available, struggled with the sheer speed of the attacks, and the attacks came in waves. During the Battle of Okinawa, over 400 kamikaze sorties were launched between April and June 1945. Yet, even against kamikazes, the proximity fuse remained the most effective defense. Statistical analysis showed that ships firing proximity-fused ammunition shot down kamikazes at significantly higher rates than ships using conventional ammunition. The 5-inch anti-aircraft guns firing VT shells proved to be the most effective weapon against suicide attacks, far outperforming smaller caliber guns. Analysis from the Battle of Okinawa showed that while conventional anti-aircraft ammunition required thousands of rounds per kill, proximity-fused shells typically needed fewer than 500. Against an attack method designed to be unstoppable, The fuse at least made stopping it possible. But the cost and American ships and lives were still lost at a horrific rate. In the Battle of Okinawa alone, 21 ships were sunk, with 66 more damaged. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in secret research labs, scientists worked on a problem no one dared publicly acknowledge. What if the enemy developed countermeasures? At Harvard University's Radio Research Laboratory, physicist Winfield Salisbury was covertly tasked with attempting to jam the proximity fuse. Dr. Merle Tuve, who had developed the fuse, firmly believed it was unjammable. However, Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, wanted to be absolutely certain. His reasoning was coldly logical. If the fuse could be defeated, it was vital to know before the enemy did. Salisbury worked in complete secrecy, even from Section T at Johns Hopkins. Within 2 weeks, he succeeded. Using a radio jammer, he could trigger the fuses to detonate prematurely at 4,000 feet from the target, instead of the intended 40 feet. This was a devastating vulnerability. The discovery was classified at a level even higher than the proximity fuse itself, because if the Germans or Japanese found out that radio jamming worked, every proximity fuse shell would be rendered useless. The security around this countermeasure was so tight that even most of the scientists working on the fuse program were unaware of it. Fortunately for the Allies, neither the Germans nor the Japanese discovered this weakness. The Japanese did develop their own proximity fuse late in the war, but it never saw combat deployment before their surrender. German scientists researched over 30 different proximity fuse designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine noise and radio frequency sensors, but none of them became operational. They were defeated not by a lack of knowledge, but by a lack of resources and the chaos of a collapsing regime. If German scientists had perfected an effective proximity fuse even 6 months before the war ended, as Air Force General Sam Phillips later remarked, the outcome could have been dramatically different. But the Allies kept their secret, and the advantage remained. As a result, American ships continued to swat Japanese aircraft from the sky with seeming ease. Yet the true potential of the proximity fuse had not yet been fully realized. That would come in Europe, where the rules about using proximity fuses over land were about to change. On December 16, 1944, in the snow-covered Ardennes forest, German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer divisions, supported by infantry, punched through American lines in a desperate attempt to reach Antwerp and split the Allied forces. The weather was terrible. Heavy clouds, snow, and fog grounded Allied aircraft and made artillery observation nearly impossible. German commanders believed they were safe from American artillery because the weather would prevent accurate fire. What they didn't know was that they had never encountered proximity fuses. For 2.5 years, field commanders in Europe had long begged for access to the proximity fuses. They knew the weapon existed, as rumors had spread, but the ban on using them over land remained absolute. There was too much risk that a dud shell might fall into German hands. However, the German breakthrough at the Battle of the Bulge changed everything. General Dwight Eisenhower personally demanded authorization to use proximity fuses, and he got it within 2 days. On December 19th, the 46th Artillery Group broke the embargo and fired proximity fuse shells at German positions. The effect was immediate and devastating. The shells, calibrated to detonate 20 to 50 feet above the ground, showered entire areas with shrapnel. The German troops, who had believed the bad weather would shield them, were caught off guard and massacred. General George Patton's Third Army used the fuses to great effect during the American counterattack. In one engagement, Patton's artillery caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer River. killing 702 men in a single barrage. Patton later wrote to the Chile War Department, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first." By the war's end, proximity-fused artillery had brought down more than 1,000 German aircraft in Europe and killed countless ground troops. The fuses played a key role in saving the defense of Antwerp from V-1 flying bomb attacks with British anti-aircraft batteries equipped with American fuses shooting down 79% of incoming V-1 South by late August 1944. The real revelation came from analyzing what the enemy never understood. After Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals and ordnance experts asking about proximity fuses. The Germans were completely baffled. "What proximity fuses?" they responded. They had no idea what the interrogators were talking about. The Germans had noticed that American artillery had become unusually accurate, particularly in achieving perfect airburst altitudes, but they believed it was due to advances in radar-based fire control and highly sophisticated timed fuses. They never suspected that the shells themselves could detect targets. The same was true of the Japanese. Post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese commanders were equally perplexed by American anti-aircraft effectiveness. They knew American radar was good and that American gunners were well trained, but the kill ratios didn't make sense. Japanese pilots reported seeing shells explode near their aircraft, even when they took evasive action. Intelligence officers theorized that American ships might be using coordinated fire from multiple vessels or that American predictive fire control had reached levels of accuracy that bordered on precognition.fuse . True capabilities were concealed from almost everyone, even those who had used it in combat. Ralph Baldwin, one of the scientists involved in the Fuse project, later described it as the real secret weapon of World War II. He noted that at the end of the war, the general staffs of Japan and Germany had no idea what had hit them. The secrecy surrounding the weapon had been flawless. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured and used in combat. Thousands of dud shells were scattered across battlefields in Europe and on Pacific Islands. Yet not a single enemy scientist or engineer managed to successfully reverse engineer the technology. The closest the Germans came was recovering damaged fuses from V-1 flying bombs shot down over England. But by then, the war was nearly over, and Germany's scientific resources had dwindled to almost nothing. For the soldiers and sailors who used proximity fuses, the weapon often felt like cheating. One naval officer later remarked that it felt almost unfair. "We could hit them, and they had no idea why they couldn't hit us." The advantage was absolute, and the secret remained intact. The statistics tell the story of what the proximity fuse achieved. Section T analysts estimated that 278 Japanese aircraft were destroyed by proximity fuses, compared to only 46 that would have been brought down with conventional time fuses using the same number of rounds. In anti-aircraft combat, the fuse multiplied effectiveness by about 6 times. Against ground targets, the multiplier was even higher. Air Force General Sam Phillips stated that if the Germans had perfected their own proximity fuse before the war ended, the outcome could have been drastically different. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal said the proximity fuse helped pave the way to Japan, reducing American casualties in the Pacific by protecting ships from air attacks. It also made artillery devastatingly effective against enemy infantry in Europe. One naval historian estimated that without the proximity fuse, American ship losses and casualties in the Pacific during the final year of the war would have been far greater. The Kamikaze campaign, which was already deadly even with proximity fuses defending against it, might have been completely unstoppable without them. Yet, the weapon remained classified long after the war ended. The public didn't learn the full details about the proximity fuse until years later. Photographs of its internals were released, but all classified components were removed before publication. The women who assembled the fuses in factories across America had no idea what they were building until decades after the war. Many veterans who fired proximity fuse shells in combat went to their graves never fully understanding how the technology worked. The secrecy was so thorough, so complete, that the true nature of the proximity fuse remained hidden from nearly everyone who had witnessed its effectiveness firsthand. The proximity fuse became a forgotten innovation, overshadowed by more dramatic weapons like radar and the atomic bomb. However, those who understood its impact never forgot it. Admiral Halsey called it one of the most significant weapons developments of the war. Dr. James Van Allen, who contributed to the fuse's development before going on to discover Earth's radiation belts, remarked that with old-fashioned fuses, hitting an airplane was largely a matter of sheer luck. The proximity fuse turned that luck into certainty and turned hope into survival. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, proximity fuse technology continued to evolve. The Korean War demonstrated that its principles remained relevant in the age of jet combat. Modern air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and even anti-ballistic missile systems all trace their lineage directly to the VT fuse developed at Johns Hopkins. The Phoenix EOM-54 air-to-air missile, the standard missile used by the Navy, and the Patriot surface-to-air missile, which became famous during the Gulf War, all employ proximity fusing technology. The basic principle of detecting a target's proximity and detonating at an optimal range has since become fundamental to modern warfare. However, the human cost of the proximity fuse's secrecy is only now fully understood. The women who assembled the fuses at places like Sylvania and other facilities were never told that they were handling beryllium, a toxic substance used in the soldering process. Beryllium exposure causes lung cancer with a latency period of up to 60 years. Some of the women who worked on proximity fuses in 1943 and 1944 developed malignant mesothelioma decades later, never knowing that their work during the war had poisoned them. They thought they were soldering light bulb tips, but in reality, they were breathing particles of beryllium dust while assembling weapons that would save thousands of lives. The irony is bitter. These women saved soldiers and sailors they would never meet, but the secrecy that protected those soldiers also prevented the women from protecting themselves. The secrecy also meant that the engineers and scientists who developed the proximity fuse never received public recognition during their lifetimes. Dr. Merle Tuve continued his work in physics and geophysics but remained relatively unknown outside academic circles. The proximity fuse program employed about 3% of all physicists in America at one point, yet none of them could discuss their work publicly. They had changed the course of the war, saved tens of thousands of lives, and developed technology that would influence weapon systems for the next 80 years. And they did it all in silence. While other weapons programs, like the Manhattan Project, received all the public attention and historical credit. Today, if you walk through the halls of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, you'll find a cutaway proximity fuse in the collection. Donated by Dr. James Van Allen, it sits in a display case. Its miniature vacuum tubes and circuitry exposed, no longer secret. Visitors walk past it without understanding what they're seeing. This tiny device, no larger than a coffee thermos, represents one of the most significant technological achievements of the 20th century. It's the ancestor of every smart weapon system in use today, from air-to-air missiles to anti-ballistic missile defense systems. Somewhere in the nose cone of nearly every modern munition, there's a sensor descended from the VT, fuse's radio transmitter. The proximity fuse demonstrates a fundamental truth about warfare and technology. Sometimes the most effective weapons are not the most dramatic. The atomic bomb gets remembered because it ended the war in a single blinding flash. Radar is remembered because it's the foundation of modern air traffic control and weather forecasting. But the proximity fuse, which multiplied artillery effectiveness by 6 times and saved thousands of Allied lives, is nearly forgotten. It didn't win battles by itself, it just turned near misses into kills, which turned out to be enough for the Japanese Zero pilots diving toward American ships in 1944 and 1945. It must have seemed impossible. They would see the anti-aircraft bursts tracking their approach, and they would maneuver to evade them. Yet, the bursts would follow them anyway, exploding at precisely the right altitude. Even though the gunners couldn't possibly be that accurate, it would have felt supernatural. It would have felt like the American ships could read minds. In a sense, they could. The proximity fuse gave shells the ability to sense their targets and react faster than any human gunner could. It felt like cheating because, in a way, it was. The Allies had cracked a fundamental problem of physics and engineering miniaturized radar technology a decade before it should have been possible, and kept it absolutely secret from an enemy who never suspected such a weapon could exist. And by the time that enemy figured out something was different, the war was already over. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources.